Well, as I said, we've been looking at the miracles in John's Gospel, only 2 so far, and this is the 3rd out of 7, and we'll come back to some of the others, I'm sure, at some other time. But as John points out in his Gospel, I've written these things, I've chosen these 7 signs so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. That's why it's here. So everything we see in John's Gospel, you see these 7 signs, they're written, and it's crafted in a way for you to believe that Jesus is the promised one of God, the Son of God, the Christ, who can change our lives. And so we are just looking at 3 at the start of this year. As I mentioned, water into wine in John 2, not just a magic trick, but something to say, look, I'm inviting you to a glorious celebration. I don't come to spoil your joy, but to increase your joy, to give you more joy than you could ever know anywhere else. So he turns water into wine. Also last week we saw he feeds the 5,000. That is, you feel spiritually hungry, here's a sign for you. I can fill you up. I remember last week there were 12 basketfuls left over after he'd fed over 5,000 people. He's saying, look, I can fill your soul in a way that nothing in this world can. And today we're looking at this man who was born blind, and Jesus helps him to see. And the sign, what's it telling us? What's it going to teach us? Well, in verse 5, Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. So he's saying, look, without me, you can't see. You're in darkness. Without me, spiritually, you're blind. Now, he's the one who says this. I can tell you the answers to those questions that you've been longing to answer. They're the ones that you're in the dark about now. I can help you. I'm the one who can tell you what life is all about. See, I'm the one who can open your eyes spiritually. So yes, we can see, we can see physically. I know some might be struggling with sight in certain ways physically, but we can see physically, but the Bible is telling us spiritually, we're all like this man, born blind. We can't quite see who God is and who Jesus is without his help. So we're going to ask 2 questions this morning of this passage. We're going to ask, well, why do we need Jesus? And secondly, we'll ask, well, why should I trust Jesus? Why do we need Jesus and why should I trust him? And there's 2 answers to each. So why do I need Jesus? Why do we need Jesus? And the first answer is because of our blindness. Why do I need Jesus? Because of our blindness. So here's a man who was born blind. Now just think of how dependent he is on, and how dependent he was on other people. He didn't have a job. He had no education because he wouldn't have been able to read or learn. And he would have been begging, asking people to supply him with things that he needed from day to day. And the disciples were walking past him, and they walked past him, and they ask the question that most Jews would have thought back then. He asked this. They ask, Rabbi, teacher, Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents? So the reason that he's struggling, probably they're thinking, is that because of something his parents did or something he did? Is it a punishment? And Jesus says, no, you've got it all wrong. The reason this man has been born blind is to teach you something now. I'm going to use him to show you something about yourselves. And so Jesus then, he spits on the floor. He makes a paste out of the mud, and it would have been warm. And so the blind man would have been able to feel it on his eyes. And then Jesus puts the mud, this paste, on his eyes and says, right, now go and wash. So this man is very understated. 7, go wash in the pool of Siloam. So the man went, he washed, and he came back seeing. That was it. Job done. Easy for Jesus. He said, go and wash. And just imagine for a moment, we can read this passage, and maybe some of us are familiar with the story, but here's a man who'd never been able to see. And suddenly, he's like, that's what you look like. All right, that's what my family looked like. Or that's what my friends look like. Or that's green. Or that's red. Those kind of things. Wow, I can see. And suddenly his world is just turned upside down. Things that he had no idea of before, suddenly, now they made sense to him. And the reason Jesus does this miracle, again, it is a compassionate miracle. It does show love and kindness for this man, but he's doing it in a way to show us something, to teach us something about us. So as this man sees physically, we see that he's in a journey of belief as well. So throughout the passage, he starts to see more and more of who Jesus is. So he is seeing, not just physically, but spiritually. And the people around him, in contrast, they are just getting blinder and blinder and blinder. They're refusing to acknowledge who Jesus is. Now, just look at the blindness in this passage. I'll point it out as we read through. You might have noticed it. But his neighbours, first of all, they refused to acknowledge who he is. Let me read verses 8 and 9. The neighbours and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Is not that the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It is he." Others said, No, he's just like him. But he kept saying, "I'm the man." So here he is, this man who they all knew was blind, because they knew him, he was blind from birth. And they were saying, "He looks a lot like that blind man, doesn't he? Oh yeah, but it can't be him because he can see." And he's there standing saying, "It's me. I'm the same person." But they're refusing to acknowledge it. They say, no, it must be his lookalike. It must be his doppelganger. It can't be him. And so they don't see what Jesus has done. Not only that, but as you work through the passage, you meet the Pharisees, the religious leaders, those who knew a lot of information about religion, were very good at keeping the rules. And the religious leaders of the day were kind of brought in on this. They said, "What's going on here?" And so they brought to the man of the Pharisees, the man who'd formerly been blind. And the Pharisees, what did they say? Some of the Pharisees say, "Well, this man isn't from God because he did this miracle on the Sabbath." So they're refusing to acknowledge because of the day he did it on. And verse 15 shows this. They say, the Pharisees again asked how he received his sight, and he said, "He put mud on my eyes, I washed and I see." And some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God." They just refuse. He can't be from God. And then you come to his parents, the parents of the boy who knew that their son was born blind. They could have told you stories about him growing up without being able to see. And yet they come to him and they say, "Is this really your son?" So yeah, he's our son, but we don't know how we're going to see. We can't explain it. So they're refusing to acknowledge again who Jesus is. So there's blindness all around spiritually. They can't see who Jesus is. Now the Jews, remember, were waiting for a Messiah. They were waiting for somebody to come as the promised one of God to fix their relationship with God. They were waiting. And one of the signs of the Messiah that we're told about in the Old Testament, look out for this. If somebody starts to heal blind people, you should take note. So in Isaiah 29, so written 700 years before Jesus was born, "In that day the deaf shall hear the words of a book, and out of their gloom and darkness the eyes of the blind shall see." So when the Messiah comes, look out for this miracle. And again in Isaiah 35, "The eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped." So here they are. They know this was a sign of somebody of the promised one, but they just refuse to believe it. See, the Pharisees think they've got it sorted, think they've got everything nailed down, but actually they're in darkness. And so at the end of the passage, verse 41, it says, said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say, 'We see,' your guilt remains." Jesus saying to them, look, spiritually, you're clueless. You can't see. And the fact you think you can proves you're blind. Now, how does this all help us? What's this got to do with us today? How does this apply to our lives? Well, Jesus is telling us today, without him, spiritually, there's another realm that we can't see and know because we're spiritually blind naturally. Jesus' point in verse 41 is the proof that we don't think we're blind. What's the proof that we are blind is that we don't think we are. What's the proof that we are? We don't think we are. So we're blind to our own blindness. That's a dangerous situation to be in, isn't it? The biggest danger of our spiritual blindness is that we're not aware of it. We can't see it. It's a bit like if you think of, do you remember Britain's Got Talent or X Factor used to be years ago? People come on and they say, yeah, I'm the best singer since, whoever, place your favourite singer here. I'm amazing. And they're building themselves up. And then they open their mouth and you think, oh dear. And they're there for us to laugh at, that's the idea. But they're deaf to their own musical abilities, aren't they? They think they're amazing. But they can't. They haven't got a clue. They can't sing a note in tune at all. But Jesus is saying that's our problem spiritually. We think we've got it sorted, and the problem is, because of that, we're spiritually blind and helpless. Now, maybe you're thinking this morning, you can sit there and think, how dare the Bible say that we're spiritually blind? How dare the Bible say that? That's quite a hard thing to hear, isn't it? Well, let's just think through a few things together, just to expose something of our spiritual blindness. Let's ask some basic questions of life. What's the purpose of us being here? What's the reason we're on this world? Have you got an answer to that? And if you have got an answer to it, what's it based on? Is it based on a hunch, a feeling, a documentary, a podcast? What are we basing our big answers to the biggest question of all on? It's a big question that we need answering, isn't it? And yet, we just live ignoring that question. We kind of push it to the side and we think, oh, I don't know the answer actually. Or if I do, if I have to kind of try and explain it, it's not really thought through or not really based on anything. It's just a hunch or things that I've heard from other places. Or maybe your personal life. Are there things you've done? I think, I can't believe I've done that. I can't believe I said that, or I did that again, or I said that again. And we kind of, we live with that kind of conflict or contradiction in our lives, but we can't explain it. But it's a big part of our lives. Think, I've done it again, or I've done this, done that. How do we keep making the same mistakes? What's the answer to that? Spiritually, we've got a problem, the Bible says, but we can't seem to acknowledge it. We don't want to admit it. And not only that, we look at our world around us, and we look at the problems that we face. What's the answer to the problems around us? Well, the government will say the answer is education. Just throw education at it, or money, or technology. And all those things are important in the right place. But we've got more education now, or more thought through in our educational policies than we ever have been. We've got, well, we haven't got much money, but we've got more technology than we've ever had. And yet, the state of us, as a world, as a nation, are we any better off than we were years ago, really? Yes, in certain ways, with certain developments technologically, but as a people, as a society, we're in a mess, aren't we? I think we could all admit that. And so we think, well, what's going on? We're more developed now than we've ever been, but you look at the 20th century, more people died in the 20th century in wars than all the other centuries combined. And we're getting better, are we? Well, there's something wrong, but we're refusing to acknowledge it. As we see the lostness all around us, there's brokenness, isn't there? There's pain, there's heartache, and we don't seem to have the answers. However developed we seem to get, we don't seem to want to acknowledge it. There's a great way of illustrating this by a man called H.G. Wells. So in 1937, he's a famous author. He wrote War of the Worlds and A Short History of the World. And in this essay, The Short History of the World, in 1937, so think of the date, the First World War had finished. In 1937, he says this: "Can we doubt that presently our race will more than realize our boldest imaginations, that it will achieve unity and peace, that our children will live in a world made more splendid and lovely than any palace or garden that we know, going from strength to strength in an ever-widening circle of achievement? What man has done, the little triumphs of his present state, form but the prelude to things that man has yet to do." He's full of optimism. As humans, we are going to flourish. We are on the way up. But then in 1946, so a year after the World War had finished, it's the year he died actually, at 80 years old, he wrote another essay, and it was called this: "A Mind at the End of Its Tether." And this is what he said: "The cold-blooded massacres of the defenseless, the return of deliberate and organized torture, mental torment and fear to a world from which such things had seemed well-nigh banished, has come near to breaking my spirit altogether. Homo sapiens, as he has been pleased to call himself, is played out." Can you see, he was full of optimism, and then the war happened. You think, what on earth is going on? I don't get it. And yet, here we are, 25 years into the 21st century, and don't we see the same? There's wars, there's battles, there's fights. You think, what is going on? You see, without God, we were in darkness. There's no assessment of how we're doing. We're blind to our own blindness. We need light. You could say we need the light of the world. You see, why do we need Jesus? Because we're blind, because of our blindness. But secondly, we need Jesus because of our bias. Because of our bias. Now, do you notice this account? The Pharisees have written off Jesus in verse 16. They say he can't be from God because of the Sabbath. He did this miracle on the Sabbath. So Sabbath, remember, was a Saturday for the Jews. It was a very special day where they weren't allowed to do anything at all. They'd added lots of man-made rules to God's idea is rest, have a rest, but they made loads of rules, said you can't do this, you can't do that. And Jesus had broken their religious rules. They'd probably made it think like, well, he'd made mud, so he was working. So how can he be from God if he's doing that? And here's this man who's born blind, being healed on the Sabbath. And they say, well, he can't be from God because he did that on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees just more and more descend into darkness as they refuse to acknowledge who Jesus is. And verse 24 and 25 is funny, isn't it? Because he says this: For the second time, so they'd already cross-examined this man, they ask him in again and they say, give glory to God. We know that this man, Jesus, is a sinner. And he answered them, look, whether he's a sinner, I don't know. One thing I do know, though, I was blind and now I see. It's like, why don't you get it? I don't know what's going on here, but I know that I was blind and I now see. And they say, verse 28, they revile him. Oh, you're a disciple of his, but we're a disciple of Moses. Verse 29, we know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we don't know where he comes from. So the blind man is there saying, look, he's healed me. That's all I can say. And then verse 30, the man says, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshipper of God and does his will, God listens. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of the man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. He's saying, look, I don't understand this, but all the evidence seems to be pointing to this man Jesus as someone special. Don't ignore him. Don't write him off. But they kept writing him off. What as we're reading through that? We're thinking, Pharisees, you need to look at the evidence here. You just search this out because it's there, clear as day. But they're ignoring it. They're ignoring him. Why? Well, because it didn't fit in with their worldview. And so they refuse to look at the evidence. It seems irrational, illogical to us, but because of their preconceived ideas, because Jesus didn't fit in their way of thinking, they refused even to look at the evidence of, here's a man born blind, now he can see. But, as we think of how this helps us, we can all be a bit like the Pharisees. We all have got biases that keep us away from looking at who Jesus is. We don't want to, mate. We don't want to think about him. And I wonder, have you got any preconceived ideas about Jesus, about Christianity, that keeps you from looking at the Bible? Maybe you just think, you just never have looked, because there's things in your mind, think, I don't want to because of this or that. I remember hearing an interview with Lee Mack, the comedian. He was on Desert Island Discs years ago. And on Desert Island Discs, they ask you 6 or 7 songs you want to take, and they take you through their life, and they tell you some stories about things. And as they also say, when you're on the Desert Island, you'll be given the Bible and complete works of William Shakespeare. There's 2 books you get given anyway. And he said this, I'd like to take the Bible and read it. And then he said, imagine if aliens landed and asked, so what's Earth? What's human life all about? I'd have to say, well, there's this book that claims to give the answers, and they'd ask us, so what does the book say? And it wouldn't be silly if most of us have to reply, I don't know, I haven't read it yet. He sees and he's like, the Bible claims to have all the answers of life, claims to be this, but actually we just leave it, we just ignore it. See, maybe there's preconceived ideas that put us off, our bias against God, and we haven't even looked at the evidence for ourselves. I wonder this morning, are you willing to doubt your doubts? Are you willing to question your questions about Christianity and Jesus and who he is? A man called Aldous Huxley, he wrote the Brave New World in the first half of the 20th century. He was an atheist. And listen to what he says. He's quite open about it. He says this, I had motives for not wanting the world to have meaning. Consequently, I assumed that it had none, and was able, without any difficulty, to find satisfying reasons for this assumption. Most ignorance is able to overcome ignorance. We don't know because we don't want to know. Those who detect no meaning in the world generally do so because, for one reason or another, it suits their books that the world should be meaningless. For myself, as no doubt for most of my contemporaries, for the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation, sexual and political. He basically said, I didn't want God to be true. I didn't want it to answer to anybody else. And so when I chose that, everything else, I could convince myself of anything else. You see, he didn't want to answer his life to answer to anybody because of his bias against God. But that, can you see, is making us illogical and irrational with refusing to look at the evidence for Jesus. Why do we need Jesus? Because of our blindness and our bias. We're in darkness and we refuse to acknowledge it. I wonder today, have you ever really asked and looked at the evidence? Well, I want us to look at that bit now, because we've thought, why do we need Jesus? Because of our blindness and our bias. But secondly, let's ask, why should we trust him? Why should we trust Jesus? The first reason is because of the evidence. Because of the evidence. So John 20, in the Gospel of John, at the end of it, he says, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. There's loads more I could have chosen, but these are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. So when Jesus came to earth, he did all these amazing things, and the historians of the time wrote about him. Everybody agrees that Jesus existed. A man called Jesus really existed. And you can read John's Gospel, an eyewitness account of his life, that shows who he is. And the question is, will you look? Will you look? I'm sure you've heard of a man called Galileo in the Queen song, Bohemian Rhapsody, if nowhere else. But in the 16th century, everybody thought the Earth was at the centre of the solar system. Yeah, so the Earth was here, and everything else revolved around the Earth. And Galileo invented this amazing telescope, and he wanted to prove to fellow scientists that the Earth wasn't at the centre of the solar system. That's all his colleagues needed to do, was look down this telescope. So he was trying to get them, look. Can you just look? And I can show you something that will change the way you see science, the way you see the solar system. Because he wanted to show them the sun was at the centre rather than the Earth. But you know what? They refused to look. They said, no, you've got to be wrong. They just refused to look at the evidence. Just look at the telescope. But they refused. I wonder today, I just want to challenge you. Have you honestly looked for yourself at the evidence of Jesus? Here's somebody who claims to be God in flesh, God in skin. He's walked on this earth. We've got historical accounts of his life. Have you read them? I really believe if you read John with an open mind and say, is this true? It'll change your life. If you haven't read it yet, we've got them, they're dotted around. Please ask me for one. Take it, read it, and ask that, is this true? Is this real? It can change your life. Don't be like Galileo's colleagues who say, I just refuse to look. The evidence is there. Look for yourself. Search it out. And you'll see that we can trust him. So why can we believe in him? Because of the evidence. But secondly, I want us to see this, also because of his compassion. Because of his compassion. I think when you look at the person of Jesus, and when you read this gospel stories, his character is just so wonderful. And you see his love and compassion to those around. So midway through this passage, the man's parents are brought to the Pharisees. And they were afraid to answer honestly, because they knew if they sided with Jesus, they'd be thrown out of the synagogue. In verse 22, his parents said these things. They didn't say Jesus could be the promised one of God, because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed if anyone confessed Jesus to be the Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, ask him what's happened. So can you see there the problem? The Pharisees have said, if anybody says that Jesus is from God, that Jesus is the Son of God, the Messiah, then we're going to cast them out of the synagogue. Now, that was a major thing. The synagogue was the heartbeat of the community. And so if they were cast out of the synagogue, that meant they couldn't be with their friends, they would have been outcasts, they would have been hated by those around them. So they didn't want to do that. And so they refused to acknowledge that Jesus was from God. And again, that can be something for us, can't it? We can feel pressure because maybe of preconceived ideas or what other people might think of us. We might say, well, I don't want Jesus to be true because I don't want people to look at me differently. I don't want to be a follower of Jesus because maybe people will look down on me. And so again, we refuse to look at the evidence because of pressure from outside. And these parents, they felt that. But the major thing here is we see that when it comes to this man, he has been thrown out of the synagogue because he is saying Jesus is from God. The blind man, verse 33, looks at the evidence and he speaks against the Pharisees. He says, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. He couldn't have healed me if he wasn't from God. Look at the evidence, he's saying. And so this man, in the start of the chapter, he's a blind man who is a beggar, again, who would have been an outcast of society. By the end, he can see physically and spiritually, but he's still an outcast. But look what happens. Jesus, in verse 35, Jesus heard that they'd cast him out, and then he went and found him. So Jesus hears that because of what he'd done for him, this man had now been cast out. So Jesus goes and explains to him, look, this is what's happened. This is who I am. And this man starts to understand who Jesus is. He says, do you believe in the Son of Man? That is the title given to the one who can approach God the Father in the Old Testament. So saying, look, do you believe I am from God? That's what he's saying there. And he says, well, I don't know. And he says, look, I am him. And then he believes. And you track him through the passage. Verse 11, they say, who is this man? And he says, the man is called Jesus. That's all I know. Then by verse 17, he says, oh, he's a prophet. And then verse 38, we see, by now he worships him. Now, a Jewish man in the first century worshipping another human being should make us go, what? And Jesus doesn't tell him off. He doesn't say, you don't worship me. No, he accepts it because he is saying, I deserve the worship. This is who I am. And Jesus goes to him and he explains to him and he looks out for him because now he's been cast out because of him. But what makes Jesus' compassion and his love more poignant, really, is how Jesus was going to experience something very similar to this man. So a few chapters later, Jesus comes into Jerusalem and he's on his way to the cross. And the crowds kind of, they love him, they praise Jesus, they give him a warm reception. But then, not long after that, like a week later, they turn sour. Because Jesus is betrayed by his close friend, Judas. All his disciples flee and they leave him. He faces a trial which again is set up to find him guilty. It's a corrupt court. He's condemned to die and he's cast out of Jerusalem. So Jesus becomes the ultimate outcast really here. And his disciples have denied him. They kind of flee when he's bleeding on the cross. And Jesus says, look, I'm the light of the world. And yet we see on the cross, darkness descends. Now what was going on? Well, one of the parables, Jesus says that hell, that is when we reject God, is where we choose to go and where God will punish those who don't choose him. Hell is called the outer darkness. So Jesus on the cross was experiencing what we deserve. He was experiencing the darkness that we deserve. And he says, look, I'm the light of the world. I'm going to experience darkness so that you can experience light. I'm going to take your place. I'm going to be the outcast. And if we keep on rejecting the light, we're going to be walking in darkness. And so that's why hell is described as the outer darkness. We keep walking away from the light, we end up where we choose and where we deserve. But Jesus says, I don't want you to go there. Let me take the darkness on the cross. So when for 3 hours it went dark on the cross, that's what he was doing. He was taking our outer darkness for us, taking our hell, so that we could have what he deserved, which was access to his Father. The light of the world says, come to me. Now that's how much Jesus loves you, that he was willing to go to the cross, to die on the cross, to take the punishment for our blindness, as it were. And he says, I'm the light. Will you turn to me? The question for us as we close is, Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. Now, there's two things. If you think of the kind of animal world or insect world, there's some insects, when you kind of pull up a rock and the light comes in, they scurry away, don't they? They just have to find the darkness. They want to hide under another rock. Well, there's a moth, isn't there? And the moth sees a light, it flies towards it. Now, what are you this morning? Here's the light of the world. Are you going to scurry away and say, God, I don't want you? Or are you going to go towards the light and see, look, I need him? Why do we need Jesus? Well, we're blind. We can't see without him. We've got this bias against him. Why should we trust him? Because the evidence is there. And because he loves us so much. And he loves you so much. Turn to him today, and the light of the world can help us to see. And when we see what he is like, we see the whole world differently because Jesus has opened our eyes.